fantastic. And once again, welcome to the members panel. Feel free to keep your cameras off or leave them on, whatever you feel comfortable with. This recording will be available on our website afterwards in our video archive, where we've got a whole host of different recordings from the last year and a half of networking and of events. But right now, welcome you to the members panel. We have three fantastic members giving their own research papers today. We've got Amy Hondsmerk, we've got Cinzia DuBois, and we have Laura La Beur. All of them will be talking about drastically differing topics to one another, but hopefully there'll be a lot of engagement here between the different themes and commonalities that come up between them. And remember, we are actually on Twitter, Mids Pop Culture, at Mids Pop Culture, and we can use the hashtag MidsPop2021. That's MidsPop2021 if you're wanting to live tweet along with us. So a bit of how the structure is going to go. We're going to have each of our three members giving their papers first, then followed by some questions afterwards. But first of all, our first speaker is Amy Hondsmerk from Nottingham Trent University, giving her a paper on Smocks and simulators in lockdown, a new beginning at the intersection of museums and digital games. And as for her bio, our third-year PhD candidate exploring the intersection of museums, video games, and interpretation. As part of her research, she's recently undertaken a placement building a short game in collaboration with a museum partner in response to objects from their collection for an upcoming exhibition project. She'd previously gained a BA in history and an MA in museum and heritage development. Amy also currently works for freelance with heritage consultancy Culture Syndicates. And she also enjoys playing video games in her free time and has been known to dabble a bit in coding. Gosh, that'll go way over my head, I'll tell you. Very impressive. Amy, feel free to take it away whenever you're ready. Get your PowerPoint up and feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Great, thank you. Just make sure everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm always worried about my microphone playing up. It has happened before. Great. So thanks so much for that introduction, Reese. As you said, just to really quickly introduce myself, I'm Amy. I'm a third-year PhD researcher at Nottingham Trent University, based at the university. And my research very broadly looks at the intersection of museums, video games, and interpretation. And today I'll be talking a bit about my research, a bit about what's been going on in the heritage sector and museum and heritage sector over the last year, and also a little bit about my research more generally, and what all of this means for the future of games in museums, essentially. So first things first, video games, digital games, online games are not new in museums by any means, and here I just have a really broad selection of the different ways that museums and heritage have engaged with video games in various ways over the last 10 years, which will hopefully give you an idea of the scope of the different projects that are already happening. Museums have used existing games, especially what we call sandbox games. Those are games that give the player a great deal of creative freedom, like Minecraft, for example, and another program called Second Life, which they've used to recreate exhibitions, sites, objects, like with the Kenilworth Castle Minecraft build here by English Heritage, which is on their YouTube channel. We've also increasingly been seeing institutions teaming up with game design companies like Preloaded, who specialise in games for the cultural sector, to design video games based on a topic or collection related to the museum. An example here is High Tea, which was based on the Wellcome Collections exhibition into the opium trade and was released, I think, in 2011. Collaborations with game companies have also taken different forms, from sponsorships that allow events like Tankfest to happen at the Tank Museum in Bovington, which is sponsored by the World of Tanks game, to museums allowing video game companies to include objects from their collections or to consult them for interpretive information, as we've seen with the objects included in the various Assassin's Creed Discovery tour modes from Origins to Odyssey and now planned for Valhalla. Museums have also started making their own games, and this is the area that particularly interests me. The V&A even employed an in-house game designer for a year, which resulted in them releasing a short game for iPad based on their William Morris print collection called The Strawberry Thief. However, these kind of projects have typically been rarer as it's historically required skills and knowledge in game design that museum staff generally don't have, and they're often very expensive. However, as we'll see, this is all changing, especially after the last year and a half. So why did I decide I wanted to research this kind of topic? Well, there were a lot of quite interesting projects popping up relating to digital games and video games that were doing something different. That was something more than just to entertain the kids whilst the parents were at the museum on the family day out, or games that were explicitly educational, which were often not really fun to play as a result. But looking at projects that were more instead exploring how games could be a form of outreach to new audiences, or how games could be used more creatively in museums. This is particularly taken off in the world of mobile apps, VR and AR projects, that's virtual reality and augmented reality, on which there is already a fair amount of literature. But for more traditional video games, there's been surprisingly little academic research until quite recently that's actually looked at the theory behind what these projects are all trying to do. Indeed, as recently as this year, articles have come out acknowledging that there is still a gap in literature in exploring more broadly what games could do in the museum sector, which is where my research comes in. My research is very much interdisciplinary. It sits at the intersection of museum studies and game studies, and its overall aim is to examine the crossover between those two fields, and specifically to identify how video games can respond to the changing needs of contemporary interpretive practice in museums and heritage. And what I found very quickly is that actually these two areas are a lot more alike than I was expecting. And I had a very interesting thought exercise right at the start of my studies when I sat down and considered the ways in which a video game level and a museum exhibition are alike. A lot is the answer. My supervisors had to sit me down, bless them, and tell me to narrow down or I'd be doing this for the rest of my life, and they were right. So I've ended up looking at 3 areas relating to museum interpretation where I felt there were quite strong and interesting crossovers with what was happening in game studies. And those areas were storytelling and narrative, emotion and effect, and rhetoric, in the sense of working through and deconstructing arguments, and in recognising that the stories museums tell and the objects they hold are not without bias, as seen in the Museums Are Not Neutral movement, which is ongoing. And we'll return to all this in a little bit. But I was pottering along quite nicely, doing some field work in my second year, maybe follow a game project at a museum from start to finish, and then the pandemic happened. So the last year and a half has actually been really interesting for me in my research, in that sense, I know I've actually been incredibly lucky. The pandemic forced museums online. It forced them to adapt to that new environment very quickly, and it often made institutions that may not have had a particularly robust digital programme look into new ways of working online. But first, what do I even mean by interpretation? Well, broadly speaking, it's anything that helps visitors make sense of the museum and its collections. It's a process of communication that happens between the visitor, the museum as an institution, and the objects. Most typically, it takes the form of the written word in object labels and information panels, but increasingly museums have been using new media to create different ways to share information with their visitors, like audio tours, films, and multimedia experiences, and even games. In museum studies, it's often been acknowledged that the material presence of the object has often a very important role to play in the interpretive process, whether that's an authentic object or a more tactile and accessible replica. And whilst there are, of course, programs out there that create 3D digital models or VR versions of objects, these were never intended to replace the real thing on a large scale. The physicality of the object is seen as part of interpretation and as a part of how visitors make sense of that object, its context, and sort of work through the interpretive text provided. However, when the pandemic forced museums to close, that physical object was temporarily lost to visitors and sometimes even to museum staff. And museums had to tackle the problem of interpreting their collections when objects were inaccessible by finding new online methods to share objects, information, and reach audiences. Which brings us to how museums engaged with digital and video games during the course of that pandemic. There are, as you will see, a great many projects and playful encounters that museums used. But today I'd just like to talk about a couple that were particularly interesting. And I think I'd start with a little game that you might have heard of. It came out in March last year. It's Animal Crossing New Horizons. Animal Crossing is fascinating to explore from the perspective of museums. So whilst museums, again, have used existing video games before, like Minecraft, in many creative ways, the sheer number and variety of ways museums took advantage of the popularity of Animal Crossing, either because people had a copy and could play, or because they watched streams of other people playing, during the first lockdown in particular, but also ongoing throughout the year, does make for a great case study. Here I've just highlighted a few of the ways that museums engaged audiences, both existing and new, through the medium of Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing was a good choice in museums, not only for its popularity, but also for the role that museums themselves had in the gameplay. One of the first things players do on their island is open the museum, and the collection and donation of bugs, fish, fossils, and artwork for the museum, run by Blathers the Owl, is a key element of the gameplay. Indeed, you can find any number of articles published in that period by museum professionals exploring how accurate the design and practices of the in-game museum are when compared to the real world. There's an excellently titled article, An Investigation into Blathers. Serious questions of museum standards, ethics, and legalities arise for Animal Crossing's resident curator, which was written by Dr. Laura Humphreys, who is herself a curator and collections manager. I recommend you look up if you're interested. The Monterey Bay Aquarium ran a series of streams on Twitch that took advantage of the in-game museum and collection mechanic by inviting subject experts to talk about, for example, from the Field Museum, the care of fossils in museums. And they did all this whilst playing to audiences, often in the hundreds, once or twice even in the thousands, which enabled these visitors to ask questions directly of museum professionals in a kind of informal setting, which led to some really interesting exchanges and a bit of demystification of how museums work. Equally interesting are the ways in which players took the freedom the game gave them to design houses, rooms, and even create their own patterns for design in unusual ways. The Met's Museum made a tool which made it easy for players to convert art from their collections into the pixel patterns the in-game design app used, which meant players could display these real-world artworks in their homes and have a player working, sometimes even making their own little exhibitions. Things like Xingning Ko, an artist who recreated actually part of the MoMA exhibition in their Animal Crossing home, and then opened their island for people to visit, almost replicating the experience of visiting the real MoMA in an innovative, online, and very interactive way. There's a particularly interesting project that I just want to highlight, which I've snappily called Lockdown Smockdown. And that was the smock making challenge run by the Museum of English Rural Life. Now, this project came out of what must have been a couple of realizations for the museum. The popularity of the game itself, the adaptability of the design tool, which included dress patterns, and the fact that they'd recently had an online exhibition of English rural smocks. So they sent out a challenge on Twitter, and this was obviously not the only Twitter challenge that went out. There's also the Getty Museum's recreated painting at home using only items in your house, which is also very popular. But the Merle asked players to design their own smock in response to the exhibition and to share it with them using a hashtag. And I'm afraid I couldn't fit the entire tweet thread on this slide, but further down in the thread, they also encourage players to use the exhibition as inspiration, or even to draw from their own experience and imagination, for players to tell them about their smock, what inspired it, what materials were used to make it. Essentially, the Merle used this challenge to encourage players to create digital objects, and then to interpret those objects for others. Essentially, to fill the role of the museum in some way for their own created objects. And they got a lot of responses. These responses really encompassed a really wide variety of different approaches to the theme of smock. There were contributions that were clearly direct responses to the Merle's exhibition, with players recreating smocks from it directly, often quoting even the object number used on the exhibition website to identify which smock they made. There were also smocks that very much responded to the current time and the current situation, as seen here with the nurse's uniform, and the creator mentioned in their tweet that they made that specifically in tribute to the medical community during the pandemic. There were also even smocks that responded to popular culture in some way, with the rather wonderful smock on the bottom left here, which recreates the Merle's own viral meme, the absolute unit sheep. And perhaps most interestingly were the many international submissions, where players from around the world took the theme of the smock and translated it to their own cultural heritage, recreating traditional designs and patterns and talking about those traditions with other players on Twitter, which provided some really interesting comparison to the original exhibition, which might not even have come about if this challenge hadn't taken place. And clearly the Merle thought so as well, because they started asking players for their permission to include these smock designs in a new online gallery on their website, which was alongside the original exhibition. So here it is, they created the Gallery of Smocks. It's an online exhibition that is still up if you want to go and have a look at it on their website. And the gallery again gives that good overview of the variety of different responses they had. Smocks responding to the original exhibition, the sheep meme, international smock designs, or ones just directly from the players' imaginations. And this gallery is a collection, is essentially a collection of player-visitor created digital objects made in a video game that, through their inclusion in this gallery, have, in a sense, become museum objects. They are presented on that gallery with interpretive text, which is co-created by the museum and the original designers, with information taken from the original tweets from the player and given additional context and information from the museum side of the museum's expertise. And it's just a really interesting exhibition to look through, and I love to see it. I want to see more of it. And the Mall wasn't the only museum doing this sort of thing. Again, the Getty Museum actually made a book out of the visitor response to their photo creation challenge, which is called Off the Walls. I have to say, I'm also quite fond of that challenge, and I appreciate the effort of the biscuit Klimt's recreation you can see here. Hopefully, though, this slide has given you an idea of just how widespread the digital play and digital game phenomenon reached during the pandemic, and beyond even, with museums of all shapes and sizes taking on the challenge in different ways. And sadly, I don't have time to talk about them all. But I would like to just briefly cover a little subgenre, so to speak, of these games, which is digital video games that were made by museums during the pandemic in-house. So whilst we've already seen that museums were thinking creatively about how to use video games to sort of encourage visitor player participation in interpreting their collections and in co-creating exhibitions with visitors using games, there's another element that came out of the pandemic that also very much interests me, and that is that the sector has discovered that making digital games, making video games even, doesn't have to be difficult or expensive. Again, museums themselves historically haven't made games in-house because the skill requires a complex. I mentioned coding and people start to panic. However, I would argue that this is actually because museums don't know where to look to find the free tools, training and software that are increasingly becoming available in larger and larger numbers that make game making easy. During lockdown though, with places like the National Video Game Museum running online courses and providing information about how to access those free open source game making tools, that perception has begun to change. And I'd just like to highlight two projects that particularly caught my eye. The first is the British Library Simulator, seen here, which is a short game made on a program called Bitsy. It's free to use. It's a software designed to be beginner friendly. And it was made by one person, the lovely Julia, a curator of digital collections at the British Library. It's a fun little tongue-in-cheek, fourth wall breaking experience, which helped visitors missing the physical library visit virtually, whilst also providing a few bits of information about the library generally that those visitors may not have come across, or which new visitors might be interested in learning. And also a little bit about the Emerging Formats project, of which the game is now actually a part. And this just shows that with minimal training and no budget, it is possible to make a game. The second tool, created by John Sear, is for designing online escape rooms. Of course, escape rooms have become increasingly popular over the past couple of years anyway, so he jumped on that bandwagon. And the tool to design them is again available to access for free on his website. Indeed, Sear in his Twitter posts actively encourages museums and cultural institutions to use his tool and others like it that he also signposts to make their own escape room experiences. The example game he made is also in its own way quite interesting. It's based on a natural history museum, but what really caught my eye was that it includes some unusual ways to get visitors and players looking at and engaging with museum objects by using them as ways to find tools and ways to find information that solves clues in the escape room that they might not have otherwise encountered. So that also kind of caught my eye. But what does all this mean for museums? Am I expecting museum professionals to become game designers and expert coders? No. Well, in some ways, this has both been a new beginning and also at the same time not. As I said at the start of this presentation, digital games and video games weren't new to the museum sector. However, what the pandemic has done is made the sector think more creatively about the ways in which they engage with digital games. It's made museum professionals more aware of the tools and possibilities that are potentially out there, and that the playful encounters can be very fruitful in terms of how visitors engage with and interpret objects and collections, and can often actually lead to some very interesting and unexpected outcomes, like online galleries of visitor-made objects or books of photo responses to recreate this art in your home. It's also had an impact on academic research. Recent articles and, in fact, entire special issues have been coming out with a focus now on the intersection of museums and digital games. So it's definitely a talking point at the moment in the academic world as well. And if my research has found anything, it's that this is a really rich area of study at the intersection of museums and games. I'm not going to attempt to summarise my thesis in a minute because it's not going to happen. But I've just briefly summarised some of the crossovers that I've found between museum studies and game studies, and just some of the ways in which game design and mechanics align with what contemporary interpretive design is often trying to achieve. Indeed, some of these are I've even talked about when talking about the Animal Crossing projects and other online games that have come out through the pandemic. What I'm hoping to do with this is to turn these findings into a series of principles for interpretive game design as a kind of guide for museums who are interested in exploring creatively what games can offer and achieve in the sector, but maybe don't quite know where to start. And as Reese mentioned at the start, I've also recently finished a placement with the National Justice Museum, where I made a game for them in collaboration with them at no cost, using a free game and interactive story maker called Twine. And it's for an upcoming exhibition, and it utilizes these draft design principles in order to sort of test them in a real project. So essentially watch this space. The exhibition, unfortunately, has been delayed to 2023, but hopefully the game will be out eventually. And I just thought I'd end with a few ideas about what I'd like to see at the intersection of museums and video games in the years to come. So I'd love to see museums really maximising the potential of video games as a way to do creative and innovative projects, move beyond a way to entertain the children, move beyond something to just teach people things, but see them very much as a medium through which this kind of interpretive, interesting dialogue can occur. I want to see museums becoming game makers, realizing that these tools are out there, that you don't have to be a big museum with a huge budget who can employ a game designer to make games. But actually, if you can make a crossword on Twitter, then you can probably make a simple video game these days. So I'd love to see more games being made in-house and, again, doing creative things, taking risks. And I'd love to see games becoming a more regular part of museum work. And I certainly hope we don't lose the playful game-based outreach that's been happening throughout the pandemic. So thank you very much for listening. Here are just some links if you have any other questions or would like to have a chat. I will also pop them in the chat, and also some games I've been playing recently. Always up to have a chat about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. What an uplifting talk. Do you know what? Curating a collection of any kind has always held a kind of special mystique for me, as a kind of secretive mystique, between the objects numbers used and the kind of avenues that they use to connect objects and those who perceive them. It is, like you said, it's a kind of dialogue with the past, right? And it is something that's active and involved. It kind of reminds me as well of the talk that Professor Sylvester Arnab gave for the network a few months ago on gamification in education specifically. It wasn't in museums, but it was in education more broadly, and how important it is moving forward. But oh, that's my dog going crazy in the background. But there we go. Thank you very much once again. We are going to move swiftly on to speaker 2, Cinzia DuBois from the University of Birmingham, talking on Loki, Latin, and why classics in Hollywood matters. Cinzia DuBois is a first-year PhD student based at the University of Birmingham, whose research focuses on classical reception within contemporary literature, exploring the socio-political allusions within feminist mythological retellings written by women during the era of President Donald Trump. This should be a fascinating one. Please go ahead, take it away, Cinzia, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Ruth. Hopefully you'll be able to see my screen. And if the page doesn't change, please shout out. If I start speaking Latin and this page is still on, just let me know, okay?
Looking all good.
So, in episode 2 of Disney Plus original series Loki sent thousands of classicists into an excitable frenzy on Twitter in June 2021. In this episode, the protagonist, Loki, and his fellow Time Variance Authority member, Mobius, travel back to ancient Pompeii in 79 CE, right on the verge of the city's destruction by the volcanic eruption of Vesuvius. Whilst Mobius wants to be cautious as to not disturb the timeline, Loki incites chaos by launching into a Latin speech in which he informs everyone that they're about to die. The scene reads as such: Mihi nomen est Loki, praefectus consilii ad tempus mutandum, atque ad ferro acertum nuntium ad vos omnes muraturi estis, is daemon ignes passis per saecula in vos e vomitoris, scil haec esse vera quod ergo de futuris ad vene. This roughly translates to, my name is Loki. We are officers for the Council for the Changing of Time. I bring you all dark tidings. You're about to die. That mountain of yours has suffered fires for centuries, and it is going to spill all over you. I know these things to be true because I have come from the future. Classicists worldwide praised Hiddleston for his excellent pronunciation and the effort that had been put into the translation. Translating agents for the time variance authority into Latin isn't easy, nor is explaining volcanic eruptions to an ancient audience who had no concept of geology or volcanology. The Latin spoken by Loki is not only grammatically correct, but pronounced correctly, better than my pronunciation, for this period in which it was spoken, i.e. 79 CE, because there are two pronunciations of Latin, the classic way, also known as restituta, and the ecclesiastic way. Ecclesiastic Latin is considered traditional pronunciation, as it's a byproduct of Christianity and was later used as a lingua franca for medieval and early modern upper-class Europe. But just because something is traditional doesn't make it accurate. Restituta pronunciation is very different. The letter V is pronounced as a U, the letter C is pronounced as a K, and the I consonant, later the letter J, sounded like a Y, resulting in Venus instead of the goddess Venus, or Julius Caesar instead of Julius Caesar. The details put into such a brief scene of a show was a welcome change to classicists who are used to poorly executed and unresearched nods to ancient languages, such as Nike's Pix trainers of 2021, My Big Fat Grusk Wedding, and Beyonce's Hothmuth Coming. This lapse into Latin isn't unusual for Loki actor Tom Hiddleston, who performed a lecture in ancient Greek at Cambridge University, where he studied classics. Hiddleston fondly discusses his classic studies in interviews, which he previously expressed his deep love for Latin, in which he discovered back in his school days at Eton. What do you do with a classics degree? Stephen Colbert once jokingly asked Hiddleston in a 2016 interview, other than like, hey, you know all about Ovid's Metamorphosis, because I translated it. Hiddleston replied, I was terrible at maths, terrible at science, and then I started learning Latin declensions, and I was like, I know the answer to that, and other people didn't. And then I actually became interested in it. I think those stories are great. I genuinely loved reading the Odyssey and the Iliad and Plato in the original Greek. Whilst Hiddleston poses as the most romantic version of a classicist, not every classicist today had the same rite of passage. According to a British Council survey, Latin is taught at Key Stage 3 in less than 3% of state schools, compared with 49% of independent schools. The canon of classical education is vast, deep, enduring, and intertextual, but due to its inaccessibility by the majority of the population, many people with exclusive access to it see it as a badge of superiority. Hiddleston has a genuine and contagious enthusiasm for classics, but due to the elite nature of the subject, enthusiastic classicists must become sensitive to classics poverty. Currently, access to classics in schools relies on wealth or luck, and this creates a monoculture dominated by individuals from one particular demographic. But not all hope is lost. As of 2021, a £4 million scheme to introduce Latin to 40 state schools and secondary schools in England had been established as part of the government's effort to counter the subject's elitist reputation. That being said, the scheme extends to England only, and how they distribute this funding outside the realms of London schools is yet to be seen. In the meantime, any interest or investment into classics for the vast majority relies on popular culture. You can't uncover your passion for ancient history by reading the Odyssey in ancient Greek if your school barely teaches you French and doesn't have a well-stocked school library, if it has a library at all, as 1 in 8 schools across the UK don't. Whilst there are still issues of internet access poverty across the UK to factor into discussion, film and television don't have a catchment area, and they're more accessible than most underfunded local libraries. Film is a potent storytelling method. It can serve as a gateway to classics and mythology for future classicists who don't go to schools that grant them access to ancient history and languages. People, particularly parents of aspiring young academics, dismiss television and films as a waste of brain energy and discourage their children from spending time indulging in them. However, I shall argue in this paper that film and television can inspire academic pursuits amongst young children and adults from all academic backgrounds, which certainly favours more elitist subjects such as classics. Of Hollywood I sing, and I ask thy aid, O muse whoever Pope and Swift obeyed. Fit subject for satire and moral scorn, yet source of wit, our age's greatest form, where cheap and vulgar prophets' motives strive with grace and art, whose glories still survive, where petty men, giant egoists hold sway, who sometimes block and who sometimes pave art's way. Mankind in small, writ large for all unfurled, yet glory jest and muddle of the world. Say then, O Muse, how can one comprehend this moral aesthetic mix to start to end? This is an extract from Canto 1 of William Park's mock verse history of American cinema, Hollywood, an epic production. As the Homeric bard of Hollywood, Park adopts the meter of Alexander Pope's translation of Homer's Iliad to ask the Muse to return humanity to the golden age of cinema. Whilst Park's writing is satirical, he's not inaccurate when it comes to presenting the power structures, for the divine status of Hollywood isn't much different from the ancient divinity. Hollywood is the center of filmography, and its omnipresence in global popular culture and universal appeal results in cultural assimilation. According to 29 stats from the Motion Picture Association of America, globally, the US film and television industry generates $17.2 billion in exports and has a trade surplus of $10.3 billion, 4% of the total US trade surplus in services. If we just look at the box office figures for Avengers Endgame, more than 100 million people worldwide watched that film on opening night, which is likely a larger figure than the number of people who read the Odyssey that year. So in other words, Hollywood has Olympian god degrees of influence over global cultures, societies, and economies. And we know that film is a powerful tool. The power of audiovisuals has been manifested and exploited politically, socially, and economically throughout history. And when it comes to media influence, Hollywood has the world in its hands. What Hollywood puts out has potential to reach millions of people overnight. So when Hollywood includes classics in its films, its reach is far greater than any school curriculum. Most classicists' first encounter with mythological creatures is via exceptionally early morning or seasonal broadcasts of Ray Harryhausen films. Very few classicists today can say that they weren't haunted and mesmerized by the uncanny slithering of Medusa and the Hydra, the jolted flight of Pegasus, or the horrifying mechanical twists of Talos. In an ingenious blend of live action and stop-motion animation, Harryhausen brought mythology and ancient architecture kicking and screaming into our tangible reality. Harryhausen seamlessly weaves largely inaccessible high art into film, from recreations from paintings such as Joseph Gandy's Jupiter Pluvius to echoes of landscapes and seascapes from the Odyssey in films such as The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts. There is very little difference between the movement of Harryhausen's stop-motion monsters and the implied movement in the Parthenon sculptures, the details of which are so lifelike, one can see the skeleton and the bulging muscles of myth encased in cold marble. The Athenian artists of the 5th century BCE were masters at creating the illusion of movement in sculpture, which is why, even in a world where photorealistic animation exists, Harryhausen films still feel real, because the techniques he employed with stop-motion animation are so much like ancient sculptures that we see more realism in his work than computer animation. Harryhausen's personal connection with Greek mythology is largely unknown, but from a film director and animator's perspective, it's evident as to why he was drawn to the challenge presented by mythology. Mythology is dense with examples of metamorphosis, magic, and giants, all incredibly exciting movie magic tricks prospects for a creative and dedicated artist such as Harryhausen. In classical myth and culture and cinema, Martin Winkler explores why so many directors are drawn towards the offerings of mythology, writing, "Ancient myths and archetypes recurring in films attest to the vitality of our own cultural tradition. Retellings of classical stories on film show that filmmakers have used the ancient material consciously in order to comment on their own times, or that they unconsciously reflect cultural trends. Ancient myths can also provide instances of more or less imaginative entertainment. In such processes, the classical sources may become imbued with a creative art and intelligence not readily apparent to the casual viewer. Openly commercial films set in antiquity, whose historical or mythological accuracy may leave much to be desired, can still reward a close engagement with their underlying qualities." Speaking of mythological accuracies which leave much to be desired, let's take a brief look at the millennial classicist source of inspiration, Disney's 1997 Hercules. Hercules is a messy concoction of Greco-Roman mythology and imagery, unapologetically blended together for the sake of artistic, lowbrow child entertainment, and it's honestly phenomenal for it. In a world where classicists are under immense pressure to demonstrate accuracy and high intellectual understanding of elitist subjects, The inaccurate and incongruent nature of Hercules is a welcome break from an otherwise pedantic and competitively intellectual environment. The first notable error of the film is that, despite being set in Greece and based on Greek mythology, Disney titled the hero after his Latin name, as Heracles was less marketable. The second then comes in the shape of this beautifully illustrated opening scene, depicting a room filled with eclectic ancient statues. The first most notable statues we encounter are Piraeus Athena, 4th century BCE bronze statue, and the reclining figure, likely Dionysus, of the east pediment of the Parthenon, 5th century BCE. Behind them is a small collection of ancient artwork and other statues, including the New York Kairos, complete with additional fig leaf, which was created in Attica circa 590 to 80 BCE, and as the name suggests, is currently in the Met in New York City. Notably, not all the statues in this fictional museum are originally from Greece. In the background, the audience can see crouching Athena from Hadrian's villa in Tivoli, 2nd century CE, and not everything in the frame is ancient, as demonstrated in the background by a statue of Plato. The portrait statue of Plato by John Joseph Boyle stands in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and was created in 1894 to 96. The scene also depicts the Capitoline Venus, 2nd century CE, a Pinax from Loki depicting Eros, Aphrodite, and Hermes, 6th century BCE, a 5th century bronze statuette of Athena and her owl, which is also in the Met in New York, the 5th century Artemisian bronze, and, ironically, a 5th century BCE statue of Heracles as an archer from the eastern pediment in the Temple of Apphia in Aegina. The rest of the room uncovers even more ancient and modern sculptures, including the 19th century CE neoclassical sculpture of Jason and the Golden Fleece by Danish artist Bertel Thorvaldsen, the Pasquina group, created in 2nd century BCE, and Frederick Layton's athlete wrestling a python, a statue created in 1877 and now sits in Tate Britain. This scene lasts a mere 12 seconds, yet in it, Disney condenses a wealth of ancient and contemporary high art and culture from across the world in an exciting atmospheric environment that will engage children and young adults who might otherwise have never been exposed to such artifacts. Whilst museum attendance is above 55% in the UK for children aged 11 to 15, a 2018 report by the Audience Agency found that 80% of museum goers are white due to the socioeconomic inequalities of accessing museums by Black, Asian, and other ethnic minorities. Thus, a film featuring archaeological or artistic artifacts is the closest many children from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds can get to seeing them, and that may be enough to encourage them to learn more about them. Hercules engulfs its audience members in its ancient Greek culture. The illustrations of the characters were based on ancient Greek pottery and statues, and even the effects of natural elements such as water and fire, and even the body of Megara, the female protagonist, are based on the design of Ionic columns. On top of this, Disney made a conscious decision with its designs. It made it all less elitist. For example, Harryhausen portrays Olympus in a way that's not too dissimilar from the stately home, only set amongst the clouds. The gods in Harryhausen films are surrounded by veined marble columns accentuated with gold tops and marble furniture. What's more, everything in the gods' lives is gold, from their clothing to the legs on their furniture to the cushions on their seats. Disney doesn't ignore the lavish luxuries of the gods, as seen by the beautiful gifts that baby Hercules is adorned with, but Mount Olympus is totally ethereal. The Golden Gates are more reminiscent of the Golden Gates of heaven than they are of a stately home, and the inside of the Olympian palace lacks furniture. Everything the Olympians need is created out of clouds. And I'd like to take a brief moment here to argue that the Christian symbolism employed within Hercules wasn't likely the animators shoehorning religious propaganda for nefarious reasons, but more likely intended as a familiarity buffer, bridging the knowledge gap between ancient Greek mythology and religious stories and symbolism the audience were more likely to be familiar with, making the unfamiliar mythology more accessible and easily digestible. However, this conscious decision to blend two religious ideologies for the sake of American and European audiences resulted in more inaccuracies, with Hades being the main victim of this decision. Hades, arguably the least problematic god in ancient mythology, is transmuted into a devil-like figure who rules the gloomy underworld within the movie storyline, much like Satan rules hell. Yes, whilst his portrayal may be inaccurate in terms of how the ancient Greeks related to death and the role of Hades, the end product was an iconic villain whose reputation is unmatched in cinematic history. What's more, Disney leans on the history of cinematic mythological retellings in the film, with a nod to the master himself, Harryhausen. Disney honors Harryhausen through the film's own legendary teacher, the satyr Philoctetes, named after the Trojan soldier. Early on in the film, Hercules is instructed by his father to seek Phil's aid and ends up outside Phil's house, which seems to be the head of Harryhausen's telos. Disney's Hercules makes the world of mythology, history, and culture accessible to everyone, regardless of their education, class, race, catchment area, or gender. Whilst the film is not accurate from the perspective of a pedantic classicist, with one of the most inaccurate things about the film being Disney's portrayal of Zeus as a loving family man, the film's lack of rigidity and dogmatism allows for organic entry to ancient mythology and history outside the realms of academic expectations and opportunities. In his book, The Complete World of Greek Mythology, Richard Buxton defends the choice of inaccurately presenting ancient mythology, arguing that the enduring attractiveness of ancient myths is not restricted to what is described as high art. If film, television, and computer software are solid indicators of popular taste, then the popularity of films such as Jason and the Argonauts and Clash of the Titans, and of TV series Hercules: The Legendary Journeys and Xena: Warrior Princess, suggest that the decline of the cultural centrality of classical antiquity in most Western countries has far from extinguished the appetite of ancient stories. Such retelling should not be taken as a sign of the true meaning of myths being forgotten or falsified. On the contrary, they should be a sign of vigor and should be welcomed as such. To end this paper, I want to return to our Latin-speaking Loki. This brief Latin-speaking scene is insignificant compared to the rest of the series, but its impact in terms of classics is colossal. According to Nielsen, Loki's second week of viewership for episode 2 accumulated 886 million minutes watched. Some are born into schools that offer Latin, some study Latin, and some have Latin thrust upon them. And in this case, the latter is most culturally effective and influential for the subject. Whilst classicists worldwide can sit at their computers and tear apart the inaccuracies of television and film portrayals of ancient history and languages, the result is positive overall. Film and television are some of the most appropriate mediums for classical storytelling. Television and film are indebted to mythology's lore, from ancient heroic stories to odysseys and adventures. Without ancient history, lore, and mythology, we wouldn't have Thor or Loki, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Pan's Labyrinth, 300, Clash of the Titans, The Mummy, My Fair Lady, Wonder Woman, Gladiator, Spartacus, Monty Python, Mulan, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, just to name a few. Great stories are fundamentally indebted to ancient history, culture, and mythology, and the way stories are told is evolving. The more nods contemporary media give back to ancient past that inspired them, the more aware people become of how important classics is to contemporary culture and society, and become more invested in it. Gatekeeping is a heavy proponent of academia, and particularly prevalent in classics, but such tactics will not encourage others to enter the field and contribute to it. Inserting classics into popular media is the most effective way to engage in people's imaginations and spark intrigue, curiosity, and passion for the subject. The danger we have in not challenging the canon is that classics will remain an exclusionary, homogenous pool of research and academics, which will go on to weaken its defenses for funding and cultural and academic preservation. If we want classics to become more diverse, we need to encourage diverse entries to the subject. Ancient Latin isn't just for Eton schoolboys. It's an essential skill for superheroes who time travel. So if that's a legitimate entry to classics as any other, I don't know what else is.
Thank you so much, Cinzia. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm really glad, by the way, you got the Winkler reference in there as a fellow classicist, and of course the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That's honestly, I think that's Coen Brothers' best film, in my opinion. Absolutely love it. But yeah, it's fascinating because this process of classical reception we talked about before. It's almost like the accuracy is missing the point, really, isn't it? It's almost like it's the intention of the piece, the intention of the reception versus the exposure it gives to some of the original sources and what it might shine light on for further research and for other people to get engaged with the classics more generally. It was really interesting as well. You brought up the images of the marble from Greek and Roman marble. It would have actually been painted in a rather garish fashion, much of them, whereas nowadays we can sort of whitewash everything. But that was, yeah, absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you. We'll come back to you in just a bit. I'm sure we'll have a bunch of questions for you as well. But finally, we're going to have to move on to our third speaker, Laura La Beur, of the University of Edinburgh, on microplastics everywhere and not a fish to eat, language, social movements, and marine debris. Laura La Beur is an innovative marine scientist and marine debris communicator with a special interest in deep sea habitats and novel monitoring technologies. She's passionate about research dedicated to understanding anthropogenic changes to ocean systems, especially in terms of marine debris. She has a master's in marine systems and policy from the University of Edinburgh and has been engaging in marine debris topics for over 5 years. Laura, go ahead. Please feel free to introduce yourself and take it away whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reese, and thank you to the MNPC for having me. We're going to kind of shift lanes a little bit to the ocean and to talking about science. So I want to ask you all to please bear with me. I'm going to be going over some just like language to get everyone up to speed, because I know that for many of us, sometimes I need a refresher myself also, just to get us all up to speed. So let me share my screen. And where I want to start is, so my name is Laura La Beur. I use she, they pronouns, which generally just for me means I'm comfortable with she, her, but I encourage you to use they just to get some extra practice. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that the land I'm giving this presentation on today is the ancestral and stolen land of Seminole and Ais tribes. And then Reese, you gave a little bit about my professional background. So I do have a master's degree from University of Edinburgh and a bachelor's from Florida Atlantic University. And I want to share also my cultural introduction. So I am the child of a single mother. I'm the first person in my family to have a degree, let alone a master's degree. I spent most of my life on free and reduced lunch, and I took out a massive loan to get my master's. So I just want to kind of give that background, because I think sometimes professional profiles can be a little bit misleading. And I also want to say science is for everyone. So, so with that being said, let's get started. Today's kind of conversation is going to be an inverted bell curve. So we're going to start a little bit talking about plastics and pollution and where it kind of fits into pop culture. We're going to take a deeper dive into microplastics in particular, and that's where I'm going to give a lot of that language. And then we're going to back out and talk more about plastic pollution and kind of like solutions and where these conversations are heading. So we went over that. All right. So what I think is really cool is that the age we're in now is it's the Anthropocene, right? So in geological time, I mean, I don't want to get into all of it because it's a lot to unpack, but we're in the Anthropocene, which many of you may know, is just the age of humans, right? This era, or this age, has been often called the Plasticine, just because of how much plastic we're creating and what we're leaving behind in the geological record. And I think that's a really interesting thing to touch on, just because we are having an impact on geological time. In the future, maybe like whatever that's going to look like, they're going to dig up all of the trash pits and, you know, middens and stuff that we've left behind, and people are going to unearth some of the things we've been using. And because plastics don't really biodegrade, they're going to get a pretty good idea of all of the crisps we've been eating. So this picture is just some plastic bits in some sand, and I just wanted to give you guys a little sort of look at what that's going to look like. So what does this have to do with pop culture, right? I mean, science and pop culture don't always go sort of hand in hand, maybe not as well as like Greek classics do, but I think it is like a really interesting conversation about where does this fit into the conversation. I think science can also tend to be quite elitist, and, you know, highbrow academia is often off-putting. But I think this interesting shift in narrative to more and more influencers, especially social influencers, speaking out about plastic pollution and about marine debris in general is really incredible. We also have one of I think this is really impactful, is the marine debris being featured in Blue Planet for the first time. And if you look back at those interviews with David Attenborough and with the producers, they were not going to show it initially. They were just going to stick to their generally scheduled conversation of different animals and things. But it was really interesting to hear that, you know, this is a documentary and they wanted to showcase what's actually out there. And I think they did it in a kind of a really moving way with the mother whale and the calf and a couple of the other scenes as well. But that being showed there the first time, I really applaud the producers for including that, because this is a reality and it is our reality. You also have like a huge uptick in eco-activism jewelry. With this being said, I would just really encourage you all to be really mindful about where you're putting your money. Some of these companies are better than others, and some of them are actually not great. So just look into them as much as possible if you're going to purchase something along those lines. And this last thing I think is really interesting, and we're going to see more of as we shift towards some of our climate goals, are some of the fashion houses turning towards more sustainable options. So you're going to start to see like high fashion houses turning towards like reusing either plastic bottles or other things, reducing their carbon emissions, et cetera. And we're going to get into that a little bit more at the end. But you're also going to see companies like Nike and Adidas have already shifted into making shoes with the upper fabric portion made out of recycled plastics. And again, just keep in mind, like sometimes they say, oh, this is ocean plastics, but it's not really, it's just diverted from necessarily being like an ocean plastic. So that language, again, is something that's really important to keep in mind. And like I said, we're going to touch on that in a minute. If you don't know, this is Jason Momoa, and he is, he's been in the campaign by Lonely Whale, which is a great grassroots organization. They had a hashtag Hydrate Light campaign, and he went into it. He smacked like water bottles out of people's hands. He got punched in the face. That's why he's in the tub. And the whole point of the campaign was to reduce your plastic consumption, and especially in terms of plastic water bottles. So if you haven't been seeing some of these social campaigns on your social medias, I encourage you to diversify your feeds, because it's really awesome to see so many people, especially like higher level, I guess, celebrities taking a stance and being open and advocating for these things. But yeah, there's incredible social media people out there. Intersectional Environmentalist is one of my personal favorites. If you don't follow them, I would definitely recommend giving them a follow, because they share a lot of really awesome resources as well. So now we're going to kind of start that little deep dive into microplastics. Microplastics, the word itself just means small plastics, and the technical definition is any plastic smaller than 5 millimeters. So generally you can see these with the naked eye, but sometimes you can't. You need a microscope, which is largely what the work that I do entails. So there's two different types of microplastics, or I guess I should say two different classes of microplastics, primary and secondary. And all that means is if they start off initially as small, or if they break down and become small. So primary are initially small. We have generally microfibers and microbeads. Microfibers are small fibers from clothing generally, and sometimes fishing gear. Microbeads are small beads that they use as an abrasive agent in cosmetic, different cosmetics. So you have it in toothpaste, face washes, shampoos, body washes. In the United States, they passed the Microbead Free Waters Act in 2015, and they made it illegal to keep putting them in. But I think it's ridiculous that we're using plastics to brush our teeth and to get clean. It's really, really silly to me. So I would just encourage you all to have a look on the back of your, if you have anything that has like a strong exfoliant. I'm not going to try and like name names and shame, but like Neutrogena is one of the worst you could possibly use. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. Secondary are, like I said, plastics that break down from larger plastics. They start as a larger object, buckets, plastic water bottles, plastic bags. And then because plastic doesn't biodegrade, it photodegrades. It never goes away, really, in the scheme of things. Not in certainly our lifetime. But in the sunlight and high UV radiation, it breaks down smaller and smaller, becomes fragile, and it just keeps breaking, especially in high sunlight environments like around the equator, and in particular, if they're just floating in the sun, in the water, they're just going to keep breaking and breaking. So this I just wanted to show because I think it really easily showcases what this kind of looks like. So if you think of this is microflakes, but it's microfragments, microfoils, anything that is like a plastic product, and you think of that breaking down smaller and smaller, that's what that is. Beauty products, like we said, micro beads. There's also another bead that sometimes gets called a nurdle, and that's like a pre-production pellet. So these pellets, if you think of like, I don't know if you guys know like what's inside of a Beanie Baby, but it used to be like these plastic things, and they use that to ship to where they're produced. So they put all of the plastic pellets in a big mixing bowl and melt it down and then extrude it into whatever product. And that's kind of how they transport these. But we're not seeing as many of those in the sampling that I've been doing, because there's been some follow through on like when that stuff spills, especially from being shipped from one place to the other. The biggest thing is clothing and microfibers, and we're going to talk about that in a minute and like how they get into the water. Whoa. I skipped ahead. I lost control. All right. So how do microplastics get into the ocean? I mean, it seems kind of weird, but maybe it's something we don't really think about in general. And it's pretty easy. They're everywhere. I hate to tell you guys, but there's microplastics in the air that we breathe, in the water that we drink, in the food that we eat. It's not necessarily the worst thing. It's also not necessarily a good thing either. Everything that we do that uses a plastic product is going to create microplastic dust. The tires that we drive on, like tires, makes up a huge portion of microplastics in the environment. I mean, there was just a study published that is showing up in like canned meats. And it's just generally everywhere. Anytime you wear a polyester shirt and you're engaging in a way that is breaking off those bits, it's going to be around you and you're going to be breathing it in. This is not to scare anyone. This is like the reality of what this work looks like. So how do they get into the ocean? They're everywhere. They wash in with rain events into the storm drains. Those storm drains lead to the waterways. So I think just to circle this back to pop culture, if you've seen Finding Nemo, they talk about how all drains lead to the ocean. And in a way, that is very true. Sometimes they go through water treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants, but that water is treated and then is put back into the ocean or whatever body of water is nearby. Humans have not come a long way in terms of taking care of our waste. I will just say we are under the illusion that we are taking care of it well, but we really are not. So in the household wastewater, you take a shower, if you're using these cosmetic products that have beads in them from your toothpaste or your face wash, you're washing your clothes in the washing machine, breaking apart that abrasive power breaks apart the microfibers, and all that water goes to treatment plants. Generally speaking, wastewater treatment plants don't get updated since they get put in. And some of these treatment plants have been there in the United States, not as long as they've been in there in the UK for sure. And they're tertiary, which means they don't necessarily take out all the small little bits. And we're going to kind of circle back to treatment plants because there's something important that I want to talk to you all about at the end of this lecture. But, there's a huge issue with these microplastics being so small that they're not taken out of the processed water, as well as like if you're dumping pharmaceuticals down the toilet. So if you don't finish your antibiotics or your pills and you're like, oh, what do I do with them? You just flush them. That gets into the water and like breaks apart. And now you've got these tiny nanoparticles of like your SSRIs, and your fish are all like on antidepressants now because of us flushing it. If I can get one thing across to you all today is just please do not flush anything down the toilet except ones and twos. Don't flush your contact lenses. Don't flush your wipes. Do not flush your cotton buds for your ears. Like, just don't, please. We beg of you. The microplastic community begs of you. And what does it do to wildlife? We talked a little bit about how it impacts humans, but there's three different big things. There's physical, chemical, and biological. So the physical is just the plastics being there. Plastic bags get into the ocean. They can drag across corals and cause abrasive damage. They can block sunlight, which is how they get their main form of energy. They are just there causing issues, becoming part of the sediment, which isn't normal. They have chemical properties. So plastics, if you don't know, are a petroleum-based product, and they have their own chemical makeup. They can leach these chemicals into water columns. And I don't know if you notice on water bottles, it'll say like BPA free. Bisphenol A is like a chemical that was in plastics that they removed. It's also terrible to microwave it. So that was like why it got taken out. But it was really at such a low, I want to say dosage, but that's not the right word. But it's like you're experiencing it at such a low rate that it wasn't really having the negative impacts that media led us to believe, that it was going to cause like an arm to grow out of your forehead or something like that. But there are these persistent organic pollutants, right, that just, they get into the environment and they just stay there. They're never synthesized. They're not bioprocessed, and they just are there forever. And plastics can absorb them. They can leach them. So that's like the kind of chemical aspect of them. And then we also have biological. We talked a little bit about humans ingesting them, but basically they are eaten left, right, and center by ocean animals. So this bottom picture is a copepod, which is like a marine zooplankton. It's very small. It provides a huge food source for a lot of other animals. Inside of it, you can see these green, they're fluorescing. So this is a copepod that has eaten microplastics, and they've fluoresced the microplastics so you can see that it is ingested into the gut. And then this sort of pyramid is those copepods at the bottom. So they have like a few microplastics. Those copepods get eaten by a smaller fish. Those fish eat like hundreds of copepods, and then those plastics get accumulated up. And then to tuna, which is a secondary predator, and then hammerhead sharks, which is a tertiary or apex predator. And you can see all those black dots are like microplastics that have accumulated themselves up the food chain. We love to eat tuna, and so we could also be in that place of that hammerhead shark. Now, that's not to scare anyone or to say that, like, we're only accumulating plastics. We are also most likely passing them as well. And, because they're so small, they're going through the gut. It's very possible that a lot of animals are also, it's called egesting. So we ingest, we also egest. It's a whole thing. We're not going to get into it today. So what are researchers finding? In my experience, we're generally finding that the most frequent type of microplastic is microfibers. That's because we all love stretch jeggings. We love them. We love a stretchy legging, and a lot of those things are made with plastic, right? And we're washing them in our washing machines. And we're going to get into solutions in a little bit, but I just want to flag that here. We're finding a lot of fibers. We are. And it depends on where you're sampling in the water column. So if you're doing benthic sampling, you're going to find a lot different things on the bottom of the ocean than if you're sampling on a beach or shoreline. And that's because of ocean dynamics. Some plastics float, so they're getting pushed in ocean and wave currents, and also in wind currents. And you're finding these accumulation zones. I don't know if you've heard of the gyre, like the Great Pacific Ocean Garbage Patch. It's not necessarily like just a floating mat of plastics. I mean, there is a lot of that, but it's throughout the water column, because as these plastics are in the water floating, they accumulate, like barnacles will grow on them. They get different biofouling materials, and it causes them to sink. And so it's not just at the surface. Like, plastics are everywhere, like truly, truly everywhere. And it's a problem. But we're finding more fibers in the microplastic community. We're finding a lot more fibers than anything else. We're also finding more fibers in the environment than in seafood, which is, I guess, good news. There was a lot of pressure on, especially shellfish aquaculture, to understand how much microplastics were like in oysters and clams that were made for human consumption. And compared with what's been seen in the environment, what's in those shellfish is actually low. And so we're trying to understand if they are selectively excluding those particles because they're not yummy and tasty, and they're like, we don't like that, or if they're just processing them through and it's not really a problem for them. And also, like, there's certain species that are not necessarily good indicators of overall pollution. So for example, oysters, it's very possible that they're selecting out, some might get in, but they're selecting out microparticles. So they're not necessarily a good species indicator over something that is just like streaming water and doesn't have that selective. But what are those species, and where do they live? We're trying to figure that out. And I want to just say, like, that's not to say that microplastic pollution isn't a real problem. Like, it truly is. But the extent of the problem is what we're still trying to figure out. And because it's small and they're everywhere, it's really challenging. A huge thing that we've been seeing is this shifting of language and of understanding. So all microplastics are anthropogenic debris, right? They're all human-made. But not all anthropogenic debris is microplastics. And generally just what that means is that, you know, you think of all the trash that we create, not all the trash is plastic trash, plastic waste, right? So you're also going to see styrofoam, you're going to see cellulose fibers. What a cellulose fiber is, when you wear a shirt that's 50% cotton and 50% polyester, those cotton fibers are cellulose fibers. They're plant material based. And then that polyester bit is going to be where you get your microplastic fibers from. And then this part, I don't really want to get into it too deep because it is so ridiculously technical, but FTIR, which just is basically the fancy way of saying a laser beam, pings a piece of plastic, refracts the signature back, and you can take that signature and match it with others in a known library, and it'll tell you what type of microplastic. So a big part of plastic pollution is like, where do we put the blame? Like, whose fault is this, right? Like, who's putting all these things into the ocean? And I can tell you with microplastics, it's really difficult. So, you know, if you've got a bunch of Coke bottles washing up on shore and they have that very, you know, significant red cap, perhaps the label is gone, but you can sort of be like, oh, we know what this is. We know where this comes from, right? But for microplastics, you don't get a lot of those indicatings. So you have to do this FTIR work. It's very expensive. It's very new because of how expensive it is. And it doesn't really, you can't really pinpoint a source. It'll just say like, oh, well, this fiber is polyester. So then you could go to the library and be like, okay, well, any clothing with polyester, but it's clothing based. Whereas some of the fishing gear pings back a different signature, and you can say, oh, this is fishing gear based. So this is helping the community to pinpoint like a rough source, but not necessarily, there's no way to put blame on anyone. Another thing I just want to point out is that when I started this work, both of these fibers are not microplastics. But when I first started, we were calling both of them microplastics. This top fiber, they're both blue, they're both sort of the same shape. And so you're inclined to just be like, oh, yep, boom, microplastics. This top fiber is a plastic. You can sort of see a uniform shape and thickness. This bottom one is actually a cellulose fiber. And I mean, you guys will probably never have to identify microplastics in your lifetime, but this is an insider trick. You can see that it's flattened and a little bit twisted, and the color is not necessarily uniform. And that is just very stereotypical of a cellulose fiber. But as little as 2-3 years ago, this wasn't like general knowledge. The community was just listing all these dyed fibers as microplastics. So now we call them anthropogenic debris. We call them microparticles because we can't necessarily say that they are plastic without doing that FTIR work. So we talked a little bit about this, but do the bans, and now we're going to kind of back out of microplastics. So do bans and surcharges work? And the answer is yes, they do. Marine Conservation Society, which is an incredible society based in the UK, they have one of the largest data sets for beachside cleanups in the world. They reported a 55% drop in plastic bag debris since the 5P surcharge was enacted. So, I mean, you're over half of the trash that they're finding on beach cleanups that was plastic bags, they're not seeing it anymore, which is a really good sign. I mean, don't get me wrong. The worst thing is when you go to a Tesco and you've walked there and you don't have your bag and now you're like carrying all your groceries to your flat. I've been there and I've done it, but it's not like the best situation, but like sometimes you forget your bag, right? You pay your 5P, but it's good to know, like, even though it can be sometimes inconvenient on an individual level, that surcharge is working to reduce the amount of plastic debris that is found on beach cleanups. So it's really good news. I don't know what I started here, but even though on average, so we're just going to move on. Also conversations around like skipping the straw and those sort of things, like while they are inconvenient, while they are, sometimes people don't necessarily get on board. Skip the straw has gained a lot of popularity. Save the sea turtles is a thing that I used to hear. When it first happened, I was in Edinburgh, and going out to pubs and bars and like asking for drinks and them not offering straws, I was like, my little marine debris heart was like, yay, 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 yay. But a lot of my friends were like, oh, I can't get a straw. I don't understand. This is ridiculous. But, straws make up another large portion of picked up litter on beach cleanups, as well as cigarette butts, just as an aside. Nope. We're just gonna ignore that happened. So talking largely about where is this plastic coming from? I'm not trying to shame or name blame, but there are some factors and main actors and stakeholders in this conversation who are contributing a lot. Individually, we can do our best, and it's about progress, not perfection, in reducing your waste. But there are some companies who create a lot of waste. I will just say, this has it in unhealthy, neutral, and healthy. In my opinion, I would consider all neutral waste to be unhealthy, just because I think it's really challenging to say that it's like neutral. But so, you can look at some of these big actors. Not surprisingly, Coca-Cola Company is up there in the top. Greenpeace actually did an entire campaign called Choke, and it was to get Coca-Cola to take some initiative in having these conversations, because they have a lot of waste. If you drink soda, if you're a big soda drinker, try and get it in cans and not plastic bottles, because that small difference makes a huge impact. And cans are way more recyclable than plastic is. I don't want to spend too much time here. I just wanted to kind of give you like a whodunit of like what's happening, just to give some perspective. And then I also want to talk about in terms of COVID and lockdown. In 2018, these three major companies, as you saw in the last slide, are some of the biggest contributors. Plastic use has only gone up. And in the last year of 2020, it's gone up pretty exponentially, because we're using more plastics than ever because of the COVID pandemic. And a lot of what is being found on beach cleanups now is masks, is gloves. So just be mindful of disposing of these things properly. And also just please wear them, I will say now, as someone who's in the United States and is in Florida. So thank you. I really want to talk about greenwashing really quickly, because I think it's super important to this conversation, because if you are trying to make small changes, it can be really hard to know like where you're at and what's happening, because companies, they can put whatever they want on their packaging. And a lot of the time, some of these terms like compostable, biodegradable, plant-based, bioplastics, there's no criteria for putting those things on your product. And also, they're not necessarily a solution. So this picture here shows bioplastics. And how they break down, and they're not really breaking down. Perhaps they're biodegrading a little bit more than actual plastics, but in terms of being like a good solution, I find them to be a little bit misleading. And people are they're way more expensive. And people are changing over to them thinking like, oh, this is totally compostable. And it may be compostable in industrial complexes. But if you just throw one of these cups in your at-home compost, you're not going to see it break down. It doesn't get hot enough. It's like there's not the right microbes. It's a whole thing. So I think it's very misleading that we form these as solutions. I also want to point this out. This is, again, Marine Conservation Society. So there are like 50 washed up wet wipes for every kilometer of British coastline. This is because wet wipes generally say that they're flushable, and you can flush them, but they are causing real problems at wastewater treatment. So they get bonged up, they bust through the grates, they create huge leakage events. They're not flushable. And this just circles back to what I was saying before about please just be mindful of what it is that you are flushing, because all drains lead to the ocean. So it's a real problem that these brands say right on the package, flushable, and people think, oh, great, it says it should know, and it's really not. So it's something as a consumer we need to keep in mind. And also, can't they just not put that? Like, anyway.
Sorry to be the mean chair here, so that we've got 15 minutes of questions. If you wouldn't mind wrapping up just in the next 1 minute, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Laura.
Sure. Yeah. So solution points really quickly, buying better products, like even though they're more expensive, higher quality products that last you longer are going to be way better just in terms of all climate. So you're not buying as much, it's only been transported one time. There's home laundering methods you can take if you're really passionate. There's bags, there's balls, advocating for better wastewater treatment and just advocating for our oceans and waterways just in general. And that's it.
Well, that was quick. Thank you very much, Laura. I feel bad for being the mean chair now.
No, that's okay. I kind of sped through the last slide, but I would have liked to spend more time on solutions, but perhaps in the questions, we can take a little bit more time for those.
Absolutely. All incredibly important messages. And it kind of reminds me of there was a film that came out last year called Underwater, which is an ocean horror film set in the Marianas Trench, I think it was, and had Kristen Stewart in it. And then as they got down to the lower depths, I won't spoil anything for anybody, but as they got down to the lower depths, there's bits of plastic floating past them in the Marianas Trench. And it was a small detail, but it was very, very impactful. And I think there was an individual called Gillian Burke. You may know her from things as Country File in the UK and her work with David Attenborough. She gave a talk the other week titled "Fuck Optimism, Positivity Bias in Nature Storytelling." Whether that's doing more harm than good, whether us saying, oh, if we pull together, we can all do this, if that's actually harming the cause more than just saying, right, this is an issue, it needs to be solved. All of which you touched on during your talk. So thank you very much for that. Remember, everyone, if you want to submit any questions, please use the hashtag MIDSPOP2021. That's MIDSPOP2021 on Twitter, or just post them in the chat on the right hand side. But we actually have one already, so we'll go back to Amy. This is from Will Tatstill. Turn this into a question. The thing that fascinates him about the ACNH museum is the big difference between it and real museums, that you can build it empty and then fill it rather than continuously building incongruous extra wings for an unruly collection you can't really contain or understand. So he wonders if you could say something about the virtual museum as a fantasy of a world which is knowable in a museum format. Where you can rest assured that to complete the museum is to know everything. Yeah, very C19 there.
Very, very 19th century ideology, yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting question. Thanks, Will. Got a lot of food for thought on my front. I mean, obviously, first of all, in terms of the fantasy, and particularly in terms of the video game genre, you have to understand that there are limitations of the game. So in terms of it being, you know, a thing that you can complete, there's a thing with games where it's just like, well, you need to have the goal, or it's just going on forever. People are going to get bored, they're going to stop playing. So obviously there's a motivation there to make these things complete and knowable. Your question regarding the sort of not continuously building more and more incongruous wings actually was quite relevant, because when the game first came out, there were only 3 wings in the museum, which were the bugs, the fish and the fossils. And since then they have actually added a wing. They've added the art, which came with an update with a very shady character called Red, and that's a whole other conversation we need to have regarding art and its provenance in Animal Crossing. So in a way, it is kind of happening again with the ocean update in Animal Crossing. They had this, you could then go and dive and pick up things from the ocean floor, and then they got added to the fish exhibition. So Red is amazing. Red is dodgy. Sorry, I've just seen that, Will. So yeah, it is an ongoing thing, and in a lot of ways it does still kind of reflect very much modern, well, I guess modern, like the display which you mentioned very much reflects modern relevance. It's a lot of museum curators have sort of commented on how it's actually pretty well done. But yeah, in terms of the collection and the knowing, it's certainly really interesting to think about. It made me think about how museums have been portrayed in other games as well. In quite a few, it's really interesting. They've done museums of the video game in the game. So quite a few notable ones. Stanley Parable has an entire ending, which is just a museum of the game developments, which is fascinating if you want to look into that. Like the idea that the game is knowable.
Kind of go into that meta commentary, isn't it? Yeah,
very much meta commentary. And I think it's Call of Duty has a museum level at the end of one of them, which is all the assets in the game. So yeah, it's also a very interesting thing. But yeah, how players need to have, the game to have an end state. Yes. So it's it is a really interesting thing to think about. Well, absolutely, and definitely something people could go in more into. But yeah, obviously limitations of the game mean that at the end of the day, they've got to have an angle, so they've got to make it all knowable.
Yeah,
That's a very interesting concept.
I think that answers the question really well. Thank you so much, Amy. I do actually have a question for Cinzia here. It says here, with regards to the inequality in access to education when it comes to classics, what do you believe is the best route forward, whether it's through something like what Amy described as the gamification of these various avenues, or whether it's a case of more exposure through big, Hollywood blockbuster things, or perhaps there's another way to create that kind of exposure. What do you think?
Yeah. I think, fundamentally, it goes down to a systemic level where why do people from lower disadvantaged backgrounds have less access to museums? It's because of lack of funding. It is due to the school system failing them on a fundamental basis and having access to their local areas and local libraries being underfunded. So I think it'd be more from a governmental point of view, from a classicist point of view, and from an academic point of view. It then requires us to also start making a statement about it. And not allowing, even, pedantic comments online tearing each other apart and like, you're not good enough for this, or this is inaccurate, I found this flaw in your system. And it's mocking people for getting things wrong. It's a really academic behavior, but it really scares people who aren't in academia away from it. And it gives us a reputation as well. So from an individualistic point of view, it's about welcoming those people making mistakes, accepting that there's more to this puritanical approach. Like, putting it out there, I recently got a very long email from a man telling me that my thesis is going to be terrible. I'm a disgrace to academia because I'm not looking into Latin and ancient Greek. And he was saying, classics today are going really down the drain. And it's quite disturbing to me that people like you get a PhD out of that. That was a comment. I was like, that's the energy that people have to grow up in. And let alone if I hadn't gone to university and didn't have like the confidence that I do, I'm like, I'm still getting there, but that's what they're going up against. And that's a reputation that permeates. So this kind of idea of like making it cool in popular media, it's just a small way of saying like, look, it's more accessible. It's not behind a Golden Gate wall anymore. And for classicists to stand up for that as well in academic circles and encourage that kind of casual academia, like the pop science, pop classics kind of thing, to make it more fun and entertaining and encourage people without going to head and like tearing apart the accuracies of something and someone's approach to something. And yeah, I think it's more of an academic and then social issue. For
sure. I've had similar experiences in different ways with regards to this sort of insidious gatekeeping when it comes to classics. And I did my BA dissertation, I remember, on Hades, the Disney's Hades, and sort of tracking his reception across time. And the kind of reception of that by some of the academic community was sort of, why are you doing that? That's a waste of time. And it's missing the point, really. This is what I was going back to earlier. It's missing the point, whether it's accuracy versus, getting that kind of exposure out there. Yeah.
It's not all behind what is academia. What is established as top academia is established by someone hundreds of years ago. It tends to be of the same demographic, and then people are breaking that mold and challenging it. And it's about pushing back and not conforming all the time, and then welcoming younger generations to do the same, and by setting an example in academia.
Yeah,
I could just hop in because you've just reminded me there's something that's actually happening in my area, which is the ongoing conversation about authenticity and recreation of historical sites generally in historical places in games. And there's like an entire subgenre of academia that sort of critiques how realistic these representations are. And I'm sat there going, is this a conversation we need to be having when they're getting people interested in history? Like Assassin's Creed has got so many people interested in history. Does it need to be 100% accurate? And can we even get accuracy when we can't literally time travel back and copy it, Yeah, so it just really reminded me of that. So interesting, there's a bit of overlap there. Thank you.
Could I also add, since this theme is carried across like all three, which is I find fascinating.
I was just going to say that, yeah.
Because we see this too in the I guess quote unquote zero waste community. I mean, you have these influencers who are like, oh, I only use like bamboo and aluminum and like these certain things, which like great, good on ya, but also, my auntie's been using the same to-go containers since she was, for like the last 15, 20 years. And so that is still an example of like good waste reduction. And you don't have to like look a certain way or be gatekept by these people who are like, oh, this is what sustainability looks like. Oh, this is what being a zero waste person looks like. And as I said before, it's about, you know, progress and not perfection. But there is, even in the academia of this, especially as a new sort of emerging field of science, there's so many people who are like, you can't do it that way because we don't do it that way. And there's no way, like it is just happening now. But there's a lot of supremacy and gatekeeping, and it's unfortunate that this is, I mean, largely a conversation for, you know, the entire world right now, but breaking down those barriers. And as Cinzia said, like engaging younger people, there's a huge conversation. This is the last thing I'll say about it, but there's a huge conversation in asking David Attenborough to step down and to provide his platform to other people. And I think I find it really interesting that, you know, he's been around for so long. He's an icon. People worship him like a god, and he truly has done a lot of things for the environment, but he has an incredible platform and podium to say, like, here's some upcoming people who are doing a really good job. And we'd like to see him do that.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those things where what I was going to say was I noticed that this kind of Anthropocene that you mentioned versus the Plasticine, it's one of those themes that kind of permeates throughout all of your presentations, being, you know, how do we deal in some ways with history warping, history changing, but also how do we then deal with the regionally? I think my connection is a little bit unstable at the moment. Do give me 1 second. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hear me all right? No worries. We do actually have one last question coming in here, and it is for Laura. So it says here that the quote from your talk that will forever be ingrained in their brain is, "Our fish will be on antidepressants. Please don't flush anything but number 1s and 2s." I think that's going to be a quote that's ingrained in all our brains forever. So thank you so much for that. But it was on the back of my mention of the Underwater 2020 horror film. Do you think that horror as a kind of platform that bridges science and popular culture, do you think that that can actually be quite useful for conveying these points? I know that you know, less people watch horror as opposed to, say, you know, a daytime TV show or something like that, but it could in theory come as a really useful tool for us to convey those exact points, the really important points that you were making with regards to the consumption, our consumer culture really of plastics.
Yeah, I think that's a really incredible point. And someone else brought it up too about, you know, this eco-optimism of just always having like, and even it's something that I've been taught, it's as frustrating as it is, you know, you always want to leave people with like a sense of optimism. And it's getting harder and harder to be optimistic, especially, I don't know if any of you have seen the IPCC, the latest climate change report. It is really getting harder. And I think horror as a medium is a really interesting opportunity to showcase some of these issues. And, you know, like, real action can be made by individuals, it's true. But when you have these huge corporations who are just being driven and fueled by capitalism, who aren't addressing it in any real way, to be honest, and it's just left to us to do what we can, I think that that's really problematic. And horror would be a great genre to showcase the realities of what is happening. I haven't seen that film. I'm not generally into scary movies, but I will have to check it out because I'm sure that they pulled that footage from some of the ocean exploration cruises. So there's a couple different ones if you're interested in just seeing what that looks like outside of a horror context. There's a couple different live cams that have done camera crews, and they've seen plastic bags, plastic lawn chairs at depths of like upwards of 300 meters. So yeah, it's very, very real. Like, it's a horror film, and it is a horror in reality, but it is a reality. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a, you know, that's a really poignant message to end on, to be honest. Well, do you know what? We do have a few more questions, but I am going to have to end the event there today. Massive thank you to all three of our panelists today. Fantastic talks, lots to unpack. All right, thank you very much, everyone. And we will be back at 4:20. Bye now.